It was New Year's Eve of 2020. My friends and I were hosting a party at a farmhouse. The plan was simple, a small gathering of 20 people to celebrate the new year together. Everyone was welcome to bring a guest, as long as they respected the property. My close friend Emma and I were setting up the place, arranging snacks and decorations. Strangely, we kept losing items only to find them back in the same spot minutes later. Emma's phone, the farmhouse keys, even a pair of scissors. We laughed it off, assuming we were too distracted with preparations. By 8:30 p.m., the guests began arriving, and by 9 p.m. the farmhouse was buzzing with chatter and laughter. Since this was a relatively remote location and there were valuables in the house, I had discreetly set up a couple of surveillance cameras in the main living areas, the guest bedroom, and the upstairs storage room, just in case. As the party got into full swing, the strange incidents continued. My phone, which I had left on the dining table, disappeared for 10 minutes before reappearing exactly where I had left it. Then Emma's coat went missing and later turned up on the floor in a different room. We brushed it off, focusing instead on enjoying the evening. Among the guests, there were a few unfamiliar faces, friends of friends, which was expected. But one person stood out, a tall man in a long black trench coat. He kept to himself, lingering near the edge of the living room and occasionally stepping away to other parts of the house. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming he was someone's guest. Around 11:30 p.m., everyone began gathering in the living room to watch the ball drop on the farmhouse's TV. I noticed the man in the trench coat standing with his back to the crowd, facing the far wall, seemingly doing something near the couch. Before I could ask my friend Ethan if he knew who the man was, the countdown began. Everyone joined in, cheering as we shouted, "Happy New Year." When the excitement died down, I looked around and realized the man in the trench coat was gone. Curious, I asked Ethan about him, and he said, "Oh, that's probably Liam's guest." I shrugged it off and returned to the festivities. Around 1 a.m., one of the guests, Ava, came downstairs and said that whoever was in the trench coat had locked themselves in the guest bathroom and wouldn't respond. I suggested she use the upstairs bathroom instead. By 2 a.m., the party was winding down and people started leaving. Emma and I decided to clean up the next morning but did a quick check to ensure nothing was missing. That's when Emma noticed her purse was gone, and I realized my favorite leather jacket was missing as well. Panicked, I went to the laptop where the surveillance footage was being recorded. Fast-forwarding through the videos, I saw the man in the trench coat sneaking into the guest bedroom. He rummaged through drawers and later walked into the upstairs storage room. I clipped the footage and sent it to Liam, asking if this was his guest. Liam texted back, "What? I don't know who that is." Alarmed, I sent the clip to a few other friends, but no one recognized the man. Returning to the footage, I saw him entering the master bedroom and opening a window. Then he began dropping items, Emma's purse and my jacket, out of the window. My stomach churned as I continued watching. Suddenly, the man froze as if he'd heard someone approaching. He quickly crawled under the bed and never came out. Emma and I were sitting on that very bed as we watched the footage. My heart raced and I whispered to her, "Don't move." I could see the fear in her eyes as she whispered back, "He's still under there, isn't he?" I nodded and whispered, "On the count of 3, we run." Before I could start counting, Emma let out a small cry. I shouted, "Run," and shoved her off the bed. We bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. In the kitchen, we grabbed knives and called the police, who arrived within minutes. However, when they searched the property, the man was gone. The master bedroom window was wide open, and he had vanished into the night, taking our belongings with him. I handed over the surveillance footage to the officers, who promised to investigate. They extracted a clear image of the man's face, but he was never found, not by the local authorities, at least to this day. The memory of locking eyes with that man under the bed sends chills down my spine. The farmhouse felt safe no longer, and the eerie events of that night remain an unsolved mystery. It was New Year's Eve, and as always, I preferred a quieter celebration away from the chaos of city parties. I've never been one for loud, crowded gatherings. Even back in college, I grew tired of the party scene pretty quickly. Instead, I've always enjoyed spending time with a few close friends, doing something meaningful. Growing up in rural Minnesota, my family had its own unique New Year's tradition. My dad, uncle, brother, and a few of my dad's friends would always go ice fishing to ring in the new year. While others celebrated with champagne and countdowns, we'd be out on a frozen lake, surrounded by the silence of the wilderness. When my dad passed away and my brother moved to Seattle, the tradition almost faded. But I felt this strange obligation to keep it alive. My two closest friends, Liam and Jake, were more than happy to help. They were the rugged, outdoorsy types, big, burly guys who looked like they belonged in a wilderness survival show. I wasn't much different myself, so the three of us made it our mission to keep the tradition alive. This year, Liam drove us out to the lake. His truck was perfect for the job, big tires, 4-wheel drive, and plenty of space for all our gear. We packed everything we needed: rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled, and a small pop-up shelter to shield us from the cold. The weather forecast predicted a clear night, but in Minnesota you never trust the forecast entirely. We were ready for anything, or so we thought. The lake we were heading to was secluded, surrounded by thick woods and completely frozen over, even during the mildest winters. It wasn't the kind of place you'd stumble upon by accident. Liam navigated the snowy back roads, and as we neared the trailhead, the excitement began to build. There's something peaceful about ice fishing: the stillness of the frozen lake, the crisp winter air, and the quiet camaraderie of friends. It was a far cry from the noisy countdowns happening in bars across the country. When we pulled up to park, I noticed someone standing a few yards away. The figure was bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him felt off. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our truck. I initially thought he might be another angler, but then he glanced down at his phone, looked back at us, and then back at his phone again. The whole thing felt wrong. I muttered to Liam and Jake, "That guy's creeping me out." Jake shrugged, and Liam nodded silently. We were about to unload our gear when the man suddenly rushed toward us, waving his arms wildly. I rolled down the window, and he started yelling frantically, "You've got to help me." My friend fell through the ice. He pointed at his phone, claiming the friend had just called him. His panic felt genuine, his voice cracked, and his desperation was unmistakable. Without hesitation, Jake opened his door, and we all got out, following the man down the trail toward the lake. In our hurry, we didn't even think to grab our coats or gear. The urgency in his voice overrode any second thoughts. He led us off the usual trail, away from the thicker ice where we normally fished. As we jogged behind him, something felt wrong. The direction he was taking us didn't make sense. I was about to say something when we reached the lake's edge. That's when I saw them, 2 more men standing near the shore. They weren't dressed for fishing, and they weren't moving. They were just standing there waiting. My stomach sank as I noticed something glinting in their handguns. One of them shouted, "Stop right there," as we approached. He raised his weapon and pointed it directly at me. My blood turned to ice. The man who had led us there turned to face us with a smirk. We'd been set up. The second man demanded Liam's truck keys and everything we had on us. With guns pointed at us, we didn't have much choice. Liam tossed the keys over, and the three of us emptied our pockets. When I tried to hold onto my phone, one of them barked, "Phones too." Liam lied, saying his phone was in the truck, which they seemed to believe. They took everything, herded us back toward the trail, and forced us to wait as one of them drove off in Liam's truck. The other two disappeared into the woods, likely heading to their own vehicle. We stood there, shivering in the freezing cold, furious at ourselves for being so gullible. After a moment, Liam pulled out his phone, revealing he had tricked them. "I didn't trust that guy from the start," he muttered as he dialed 911. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together for warmth, waiting for help. When the police arrived, we gave them a full report. They were kind enough to drive us back to Jake's house, which was the closest. As you might expect, Liam's truck was never recovered, and the men who robbed us were never caught. To this day, we still don't know what those men were doing out there on New Year's Eve, in such a secluded spot. Were we just unlucky enough to stumble into their trap, or had they been waiting for someone? The whole thing still doesn't make sense. What I do know is that it was the last time we ever went ice fishing on New Year's Eve. Some traditions just aren't worth the risk. When I was about 9 years old, I spent New Year's Eve at my friend Ethan's house while our parents went to a restaurant in a nearby town. Ethan's house was incredibly old, isolated, and surrounded by dense woods. It was far from any other homes, which gave it an eerie and unsettling atmosphere. To get there, you had to drive up a long, overgrown path flanked by towering trees that almost completely blocked out the sky. At school, some kids swore Ethan's house was haunted. There were even rumors it was mentioned in some local ghost book, which only made it scarier. I never told Ethan, but the stories always lingered in the back of my mind. That evening, Ethan and I were sitting in the living room, watching TV to distract ourselves. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak or groan from its old wooden frame. Suddenly, a loud crashing sound broke the silence, echoing through the house. I can still remember the look in Ethan's eyes when we turned to each other, both frozen in shock. It took us a few minutes to work up the courage to investigate. Slowly, we left the living room and crept down the hallway, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound seemed to have come from upstairs, so we decided to check it out. As we reached the top of the stairs, a freezing cold breeze hit us. It wasn't just chilly, it felt like ice cutting against our skin. Shivering, we followed the draft down a long, dark hallway. The house was massive, almost like an old mansion from the 1920s with high ceilings and endless corridors. Every step we took made it feel like the house was watching us. At the end of the hallway, we saw Ethan's parents' bedroom door slightly ajar, creaking softly as it swayed back and forth. We stopped in our tracks, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally whispered, "I'm going to check it out." I wanted to tell him not to, but I was too scared to speak. I hung back as Ethan pushed the door open and stepped into the room. It was so dark inside that it seemed to swallow him whole. I could barely see his shadow anymore. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, out of nowhere, Ethan let out the most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. My heart was pounding as I ran into the room, fumbling for the light switch. When the light flickered on, I saw Ethan standing completely still, pale as a sheet, his wide eyes fixed on the corner of the room. To his side was a massive antique mirror, shattered into countless pieces. Glass was scattered across the floor, glinting under the dim light. I carefully stepped over the shards and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. His skin was icy cold, as if he'd been standing in a freezer. Are you okay? I whispered. Without looking at me. He murmured in a shaky voice. She broke the mirror. Confused, I asked, who broke it? Finally, Ethan turned his head slightly toward me and whispered, the woman in the corner. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't dare look at the corner he was staring at. Instead, I grabbed Ethan's arm and said, we need to get out of here. He nodded, and we began walking back toward the hallway. But as we were leaving, I couldn't help myself. I turned back to check the mirror. I thought maybe the string holding it to the wall had snapped, or perhaps the nail had come loose. Carefully, I bent down and lifted the mirror. To my surprise, the string was perfectly intact, and the nail was still firmly in place. That's when the fear really set in. My hands were trembling as I told Ethan to call his parents and ask them to come home immediately. We waited outside by the front door, huddled together in the freezing night air, until they arrived. When Ethan's dad and my dad went upstairs to check, they found the shattered mirror but dismissed our story. They said we were probably roughhousing and accidentally knocked it over. No matter how much we insisted, they didn't believe us. The scariest part came years later. I'm 24 now, and just recently I was reminiscing with my mom about random childhood memories. Since New Year's was approaching, that night at Ethan's house came up. I decided to tell her the full story of what happened. When I finished, my mom gave me a serious look and said, I believe you. Ethan's mom told me something a few days after that night. She said she saw a woman in her bedroom. The woman told her to leave the house. Hearing that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Even after all these years, I felt chills all over again. I started having flashbacks to that night, the cold breeze, the shattered mirror, and the look of terror on Ethan's face. To this day, I still can't explain how that mirror fell. For it to have landed the way it did, someone would have had to lift it up and off the hook. And as for the woman Ethan claimed he saw in the corner, I think it's better if I try to forget about her.